You are listening to the Atlanta Sports Podcast, the only podcast covering all of your teams. Bringing you the best sports news from the state of Georgia, from the professional ranks to the high school levels, we have it all. Welcome back to the Atlanta Sports Podcast. My name is Frankie Malufin, and a little bit later we're going to be joined by Luke Winstall and Dave Neal over the phone. He's the SEC Network and ESPN commentator. We're going to talk about the Georgia Bulldogs basketball today. We haven't done too much of that thus far. And we're going to talk about, in this interview, we're going to talk about Yante Maten. He's the SEC's leading scorer and one of the better players in the whole league. And we also talk about Derek Ogbede, another player that could potentially make a bigger impact down the stretch than he did at the beginning of the season. And then we're also going to talk about Georgia's NCAA stance right now. They're 44th in the RPI ranking. So they're still on the bubble. They're on the bubble team. They lost a tough one to Texas A&M on Saturday. But we're going to talk about what they can do going forward to maybe get themselves a berth in the NCAA tournament before the SEC tournament starts in a few weeks. We also talk about recruiting, something that's been an issue for both Georgia and Georgia Tech in the state of Georgia with so much talent. They haven't been able to keep enough of it in-state, most of it choosing to go out of state. We're going to talk about what Dave thinks could possibly be the reason, what he would do, or what needs to be done to change it. And real quick, before we get to the interview, I want to thank you for finding us on iTunes and Google Play and Stitcher Radio, wherever it might be most convenient for you. We also have a YouTube channel, so you can subscribe to us in one or more of those directories. That would mean a lot to us. And you can also follow us on Twitter at ATL Sportscasts. We're going to take a quick look at Georgia's upcoming schedule before we move on to the interview. So they play Alabama on Wednesday and Texas on Saturday, followed by Kentucky, South Carolina, and Florida. So that is a tough stretch, especially the back end of that 5-game stretch I just mentioned. Alabama and Texas should both be wins. The Texas game will be interesting. It's in Athens on Saturday. It's the SEC Big 12 Challenge. Texas has an 132 ranking for RPI, a little bit lower than they're used to. Alabama's ranking is 80th, but where it really starts to get tough is Kentucky's ranked 3rd, South Carolina's 19th, and Florida's 10th. Those are the top 3 teams in the SEC back-to-back for Georgia. 2 of them on the road. So if Georgia can steal 1 or 2 of those games, that would be huge to boost their NCAA hopes. And now here's Dave. Now we are very happy to be joined by Dave Neal, the SEC Network and ESPN commentator for both football and basketball. Dave, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Glad you guys could have me on tonight. This is fantastic.
So we're going to start off with Georgia tonight. What is the difference between this year's Georgia team and last year's teams and previous teams under Coach Fox?
Well, I think that Georgia is one of those teams that is trying to get over the hump, and I think there are a lot of similarities more than there are differences. I think between this year's team and last year's team. Georgia once again kind of in that middle of the pack, trying to get to the top 4 or 5 in the SEC. I do think Georgia has that opportunity. A tough loss last weekend to Texas A&M, but Georgia needs to find a way to kind of shake free of that teams 6 through 10 and kind of separate themselves and be one of the better teams. And that's kind of been the hurdle that Mark Fox has been trying to chase. I think there's enough talent there. They just have a hard time winning some games that they probably have lost in the past when they should have won. And I just, for whatever reason, I think that's probably the biggest question from Georgia is, when is that going to happen? And I think that's probably the same storyline that they've had the past 2, 3, 4 years under Mark Fox. So I think it's, I think there's more similarities between last year's team and this year's team than there are differences. I just, when you think about where the league is and where Georgia is, it almost looks like a repeat from 2016 to 2017.
Yante Maten is the leading scorer in the SEC. So how do you think he has grown from last year to this year?
Well, I think, first of all, I think teams now know that Yante is a dominating presence. So teams obviously want to take him out of the game right away. I've had a chance to, watch Yante for 2 years now, really blossom into a exceptional player. And so scouting reports obviously say, every time he touches the ball, we're going to double team him. We got to make him throw it out of the post as quickly as possible. And Georgia's done a really nice job trying to get him a little bit outside of that box, that low post area, to utilize some of his skills, because he can face up and hit a little 15-foot, 16-foot jump shot now, which is part of his game. And I think that's really made him a different player this year. And the fact that he can handle double teams has made him a better player. And it's hard, man. When scouting reports are out and you're the guy they're trying to shut down, life changes for you. I don't care if you're at Georgia or if you're at North Carolina or Duke or Kansas. I mean, when you're the focus of scouting reports, basketball becomes very difficult. And Yante has found a way to still be the guy. And when he plays well, Georgia generally plays well and has a chance to win. When Yante doesn't have a good night, it's tough for Georgia. And when he and J.J. Frazier are both on, Georgia generally walks out of the gym with a victory. But I've been impressed with Yante. His biggest problem is the fact that he's a 6'8" post player. And that kind of leaves him in limbo in terms of where he will play next year. As a professional, he's just kind of a tweener size. If he was a 6'10" post, you kind of would feel a little bit better about him as a pro prospect. But 6'8" is kind of a tough spot for him in terms of what scouts think of him.
Is there a single player right now on the Bulldogs that you would expect to improve the most down the stretch as we head into the postseason?
Obede is probably a guy I think that the sky's the limit for him. He's a young man that still hasn't played a whole lot of basketball in his life. He's a great athlete. He's got great size. He's still learning the game. And I think his skill set allows him room to grow. And I think if Yante Maten doesn't get in foul trouble and he stays on the floor and J.J. Frazier doesn't want to be the hero every night, and they can include Obede in the offensive sets, I think he's a guy that can really blossom and help Georgia down the stretch. I think the Bulldogs certainly need a third scorer. He's a guy to keep an eye on, in my opinion, down the stretch. Georgia's Georgia's one of those teams. I didn't go to Georgia, but obviously I see him a lot, and they're frustrating because I think they're good enough to kind of, as I said earlier, separate themselves from the middle of the pack in the SEC, but they just seem to always stub their toe somehow, some way, and end up fighting for a bid to the NCAA tournament every year. And it's kind of leaves you wondering, like, what the heck's going on up there? Because I think they're good enough to not be that type of team. But for whatever reason, that's always the story. It seems like when we get to late February, and it looks like we're heading that direction again.
So now we're going to move on and talk about the conferences. So how do you think the SEC stacks up as a whole compared to the other conferences in college basketball, and where does that compare with previous seasons?
Well, last year the SEC was really struggling. I think that at one point they were the 8th best conference in terms of RPI in the country, and obviously as a Power 5 conference, if you will, that is not where you want to be. After this, I think heading into Saturday, they were the 5th best conference in terms of RPI. So obviously the league has made some strides. I think it's still a league that has a long way to go to get back to where this league was in the 90s and early 2000s when it was a 5 and 6 bid, 7 bid team conference on a regular basis. It's been a disappointing run here the last decade, if you will. But I think they're making strides. They've improved their scheduling. They've certainly got some great coaches in this league. The Ben Howlands and the Rick Barnes, the Avery Johnsons have come in and really changed the dynamic. And you watch these teams and how they're playing. I think you can see how they play. I just think the level of player needs to improve a little bit. We're seeing some of that trickle effect come in. I think we're seeing, Mississippi State's one of the youngest teams in the country. I think they might be the 2nd or 3rd youngest team in the country, but they're one of the more exciting teams in the country. And Ben Howland, who came in from a UCLA program that taken them to the Final Four, he's made a big difference. And so hopefully that transition will continue. But the league has made some strides, but still a long way away from catching up to, an ACC, a Pac-12 and a Big 12 in terms of top to bottom talent. But I think there's some improvement there.
Georgia's one of the bubble teams, the three teams that are probably at the top of everybody's list out of the SEC, Florida, Kentucky, and South Carolina right now. What's the one thing Georgia needs to do to get above that bubble and ensure themselves a spot in the NCAA tournament?
Well, they got to win close games. And they got to hold on to leads. Texas A&M Saturday, they blew a couple of times. They had second half double-figure leads and let Texas A&M walk them down, and Georgia put themselves in a bad position. It was an unfortunate way they lost that game with the clock stopping with 5.6 seconds left, and obviously it was a complicated finish, but it should have never got to that point. The way Georgia should have never even been in that situation to try to win it at the buzzer on the road. Those are the games Georgia needs to win. Texas A&M has really struggled this year, and that's a game that Georgia probably feels like they let it get away, and they did. And those are the games that Georgia needs to win if they want to make that push to the NCAA tournament. Georgia heading into that game, Joe Lunardi of ESPN, had Georgia, had they won that game, he would have had Georgia as he would have had him as the fifth SEC team in the tournament had they won that game on the road. And that's the kind of victory that the SEC always seems to lose. It's one of those times where you had a chance to make a statement and you didn't. And those are the games that I think Mark Fox will scratch his head at the end of the year. And you hope that's not the game that costs Georgia a chance. That's I know it's only January, but there's still 6 weeks of the season to go, regular season and a tournament. But you hope that's kind of the game that you don't look back on and go, my gosh, that one cost us a chance at the NCAA tournament. But we'll see.
The recruiting realm is very rich in Georgia, yet it seems that most of the top talent prefers to go out of state, bypassing both the Georgia Bulldogs and the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets. So what do you think is the reason for this, and what do you think can be done to fix this for both teams?
Well, I think Josh Pastner, is a guy at Georgia Tech that's going to try to figure out a way to make this work. Obviously, he was able to get some good talent in Memphis, and obviously they're not in a big power conference at Memphis, but he was able to land some really talented players. So we'll see if he's able to do that. Mark Fox has gone out and found some talent. You're right about a lot of the majority, the big name, the big product players. They want to go out and they want to go play for the Kentuckys, the Kansases, the North Carolinas, because that's where you go. That's just what the kids today, where they want to go play. And you got to find that kid that has some loyalty to that school, whether it be his parents went there or he has some relationship with his AAU coach or his high school coach has a relationship with Mark Fox or one of the assistant coaches at Georgia to kind of help facilitate that desire to go to the University of Georgia, and maybe start that trend. There's just not that much flavor when you go to these AAU events for these kids. You just don't see a whole lot of Georgia Bulldog basketball gear floating around the gyms. And that's part of the problem. There's not a lot of flash or fanfare. At Georgia Tech back in the 80s when Bobby Crimmins was coaching Georgia Tech, boy, it was a hot commodity. Well, it's not right now, and it hasn't been for a long time. And I'll be anxious to see if Josh Pastner can get these kids to wear the Georgia Tech hat around the gym. That's a big part of it. So I think, we'll see how it works for Georgia Tech, but you got to make it so these kids talk about it. You got to make them want to wear the T-shirts and the hats, and we're not there yet. And let's hope it happens, because I think the people in the state certainly deserve some good basketball.
Dave, you live in the Atlanta area, so before we let you go, we have to get a prediction for the Super Bowl. Falcons or Patriots?
As a long-time, lifelong Atlanta Falcon, and of course my dad broadcast the Atlanta Falcons on two separate occasions, covering about 15, 16 years. There is no way that I'm going to say that the Patriots are going to win this. My heart bleeds red and black, and I think it's a great Falcons team. They're so much fun to watch. I hope they have enough. And if Julio Jones is healthy, there's nobody in the world that can stop him. And I'll have my fingers crossed, my toes crossed, and I just hope that the Falcons can pull this out. In my lifetime, it would be nice to see the Atlanta Falcons win a Super Bowl. although they've broken my heart so many times. But I'm going to cross my fingers and hope that this is the year. So let's go with the Atlanta Falcons. I think it's their time.
All right, Dave, thank you again for joining us today. We really enjoyed it.
My pleasure, guys. Thank you for having me on.
And that brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you again for listening to the Atlanta Sports Podcast. Thank you for finding us, whether it be on iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play, or again, wherever you may have found us. We appreciate it, and we'd also like to ask you to subscribe to us in whichever directory you found us in. That would mean a lot to us. You can also leave us a review there. Tell us how we're doing, and you can also contact us from our website, atlantasportspodcast.com. And we hope to see you next time with another show.